At the company's couples meeting, I saw my wife arrive with her boss. So I went up to them and said, "I thought you should arrive with your husband." She froze. I saw the exact second her face froze, as if time had stopped and the ground beneath her feet disappeared. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, perhaps trying to find a quick excuse, something to save face. But there was no more pretending. The boss swallowed hard. He tried to smile. He tried to take a step forward, as if he could turn it into a social misunderstanding, some misstep. But I remained standing there, looking into the eyes of the woman who had shared my bed, my birthdays, my promises. And the only thing she could say was my name. Weak. Shaky. Guilty. I responded with a silence of 1,000 voices. And I left. I didn't make a scene. I didn't break glasses or punch people in the face. Because there are betrayals that don't explode, they corrode. And when we realize it, love has already rotted inside and all that's left is the bittersweet smell of the end. She didn't expect to see me in that place. She didn't expect me to find out. Because she believed I was predictable. The stable, routine husband who never surprises. And she was right, I was all of that. Until that night. When the pieces fell apart and everything started to make sense, the absences justified by meetings, the laughter she couldn't explain, the messages she deleted before I could read them. I had already found out. And that's why I went. Not to confront. But to end it. To bury it. She betrayed me. Not only with her body, but with her gestures, with her eyes, with her time. She betrayed me when I was preparing a special dinner thinking it was still reciprocal. She betrayed me when she said she loved me while looking at her phone smiling. She betrayed me when she stopped choosing me every day, because that's what love is, a daily, silent, often tiring choice. She chose someone else. And she didn't have the courage to say it. She hoped I would never notice, or that if I did, I would pretend not to see it. But that night, I chose myself. For the first time in years, I chose to love myself more than I loved her. The following days were silent. But not peaceful. I would wake up with her face still on my pillow, with her smell in the closet, with the image of her smiling at another man. My thoughts were a labyrinth with no way out. I wondered where I had failed. If it was the lack of flowers, touches, words. If I had been less of a man, if I had stopped being desirable, if time had turned me into someone invisible. But then I understood, I had not failed. I had been there. Every day. With presence, with dedication, with patience. And it was she who, even so, chose to leave. And she didn't tell me. She preferred to cheat. She came home that night and found the closet empty. A letter on the table. And no discussion. Silence was my answer. I disappeared. I left with my pain, with my dignity, and with my daughter. Because yes, we had a daughter. And she saw it all. Not directly, but through my gestures. Through my looks. Through the sadness on my face and the absence on her mother's. I never said a bad word about her. I never incited anger. But my daughter, with her purity, understood everything on her own. She chose to stay with me. And when her mother tried to talk about love, she simply replied, "I'm not angry with you. But Daddy makes me feel safe." That sentence echoes in my head to this day. Because it wasn't said with spite. It was said with truth. With the cruel purity of children who haven't yet learned to lie to protect others. Months passed. I rebuilt. Slowly. Day by day. I started running. I started reading again. I went to a group for separated parents. Things I never imagined I would do. I met new people. Some listened to me. Others made me laugh. And one of them made me feel. Again. For the first time since my marriage, I felt my heart race for someone. Someone who looked me in the eyes and saw the pain, but didn't run away. Stayed. Listened to me. Touched me with respect. Desired me without rushing. Loved me sincerely. And me? I allowed it. Because I deserved it. Because, despite the betrayal, despite the hurt, I was still worthy of love. And then, one day, she came back. The woman who was once my wife. She knocked on my door with teary eyes. No makeup. No shield. Just pain. Belated regret. She wanted to talk. She said she made a mistake. That she got confused. That she thought she needed something new, but discovered too late that true love was by her side all along. She looked me in the eyes and told me she still loved me. I listened. With a calm heart. Because there, I no longer belonged to that story. It was like visiting an old house that was once a home, but now no longer holds any of its furniture. Nothing there fit me anymore. And I simply said, I loved you too. A lot. But I've already moved on. She cried. She said she understood. That it hurt. But that now she knew what she had lost. I didn't answer. Because some pains don't need an answer. And some absences speak louder than any words. Today, my daughter is still by my side. Growing up, becoming a strong woman, full of light, and proud of her father who had the courage not to humiliate himself for love. Who taught, by example, what self-love is. And while her mother is still trying to rebuild what she lost, I continue living what I have achieved. A new, clean love, without lies. A peace that is priceless. But what no one really expected was what happened at our final reunion, when she handed me a box with old letters, and inside them, something that completely changed what I thought about our story, about how it all began, and about the real reason for the betrayal. Because, in the end, what destroyed our marriage wasn't just a man, it was a choice made long before me, and that she never had the courage to confess until that day. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are totally fictitious, created to show how infidelity can destroy lives, families and hearts. Our goal is to touch your conscience, move and alert, never encourage. Get ready, because what's coming next is shocking, realistic and unforgettable. The story is about to begin. Thomas and Helena have always been the kind of couple who seem to have met at the right time, in the right way, and at the exact point where two souls, a little tired of the world, finally recognize each other. He was a soft-spoken man, with simple manners and an attentive manner that charmed even the most distant. He had worked for years in the logistics sector of a large company, known among his colleagues for his competence and patience. He was the kind of professional who listened before speaking, resolved issues before complaining, and ended everything with a smile that, even if restrained, seemed sincere. Helena, on the other hand, was the spark. A high school literature teacher, she loved words like someone who loves life, with intensity and a desire to discover what each sentence hides. She had a curious and restless gaze, the kind that penetrates the surface of people and tries to see what lies behind the silence. When they met, at a casual dinner hosted by mutual friends, it was as if two opposing frequencies found harmony. From the beginning, their relationship had an almost enchanted balance. He was the ground, she was the wind. Thomas offered stability, patience, the certainty of a home. Helena brought lightness, novelty, little surprises. Soon they were sharing the same roof, decorating the small apartment with hanging plants and photos of short but memorable trips. It didn't take long for bigger plans to come about, a simple wedding, full of friends, with live music and emotional speeches, then the purchase of their own house, and finally, the arrival of Elisa, a girl who brought with her the ability to rearrange everything around her with the purity of her eyes. Elisa was a sweet but observant child. Even as a child, she noticed the silences between her parents, the subtle gestures of care, the affection exchanged in the form of coffee made early in the morning or a note left on the bathroom mirror. She grew up surrounded by books and tools, between imaginary worlds and gardening. Thomas always made a point of getting home before dinner, even if it meant giving up bigger career opportunities. Helena, on the other hand, balanced her classes, her student schoolwork, and her dedication to her daughter with a passionate look at everything she did. There was a mutual pride there, a kind of silent admiration that didn't need to be said, it just felt. During the first years of their marriage, the bond between the two seemed unshakable. When arguments arose, they were resolved through conversation and respect. They were, by all indications, life partners. The routine, even though it was present, did not seem to be a burden, but rather a choice, waking up every day next to the same face, making coffee together, sharing the news from the newspaper, talking about Elisa's school, the new project at work, the unfinished series on streaming. Life went on smoothly, safely, perhaps too predictable for some, but for them, comfortable. The kind of life that many people long for, few build, and almost no one values until they realize how rare it is. Helena used to organize a book club with her friends on Saturday afternoons, and Thomas would devote himself to home repairs, sometimes to the garden, sometimes to a small carpentry project he kept in the backyard. On Friday nights, wine and movies, on Sundays, long lunches and walks in the park with Elisa. At times, it was possible to sense that she, restless by nature, wanted something beyond that predictability. Not out of open dissatisfaction, but through a sparkle in her eyes that would light up when she talked about trips they hadn't taken yet, plays they hadn't seen, or old childhood dreams that were left behind when Elisa was born. But this never turned into bitterness. It was more like a sigh, a kind of nostalgia for something that perhaps wasn't meant to be experienced now, but that still pulsed somewhere inside her. Thomas, for his part, had no problem keeping his feet firmly on the ground. For him, stability was synonymous with happiness. Seeing them well, his wife and daughter, was enough. He knew he was not a man of great emotions, but he trusted that his love was expressed in the details, the bills paid on time, the car washed on Saturday, the simple bouquet on any given Tuesday. Maybe it wasn't the romance of Helena's books, but it was the real love he knew how to offer. And that, until then, seemed to be enough. Their close friends regarded them as a couple of references. At family gatherings, they praised Elisa for her politeness, for the complicity between them, and for their cozy and lively home. Thomas's co-workers often commented on how lucky he was to have a wife like Helena, cultured, engaging, admired by everyone. Helena's colleagues, on the other hand, emphasized how privileged she was to have such a constant and present husband, something that, according to them, was rare to find in today's times. They smiled at these comments, perhaps believing them, perhaps just repeating the role they had rehearsed so well. Time passed. And like every true story, moments of separation came. Not fights, not visible ruptures, but a silent, almost imperceptible separation. Thomas started going to bed earlier. Helena started spending more time at school and participating in more events outside. Elisa grew up, demanding less attention, and this, which should have been a phase of rediscovery for the couple, slowly transformed into a kind of emptiness disguised as routine. Nothing serious, nothing painful, just a space that grew between them, filled with silences that were too comfortable. Still, there were moments of tenderness. A coffee made with love, a back massage on days of pain, a shared laugh over some silly memory. But there were also absences. Small, occasional ones. A distracted glance during dinner. A conversation interrupted by a notification on the phone. A kiss that became mechanical. Things that go unnoticed, until they accumulate. Helena, in particular, seemed to be seeking some kind of self-recovery. She talked more about the books she read, about ideas for literary projects, about debates at school. She started going out with her classmates a little more, getting involved in committees, seminars, and discussion groups. Thomas supported her. He was never a controlling man. But perhaps that was why he didn't realize how much she was distancing herself, not out of malice, but out of an intimate need to reconnect with something she herself couldn't name. And then the invitation came. An event at the company where Thomas worked. A formal, elegant couples gathering, where employees would bring their partners and everyone would share an evening of fellowship and appreciation. It was the kind of occasion that Thomas would normally avoid, but something about that month motivated him. Maybe the desire to get closer to Helena, maybe an intuition that was hard to explain. He bought a new suit, reserved the table in advance, carefully selected the details. And he told his wife with restrained enthusiasm. She said she would try to go, depending on her school schedule. He trusted her. That night, Thomas arrived at the ballroom before most. He looked at the tables, the familiar faces, the toasts, the smiles. He was ready to celebrate a life built with effort, dedication and love. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, fate was beginning to sew an invisible knot that would very soon transform his life irreversibly. And among all the looks he would encounter that night, there was one in particular that he would never forget, that of the woman he chose every day, and who, at that moment, prayed that he hadn't shown up. But he appeared. And from that moment on, the story would take a turn that not even the most tragic of novels would be able to foresee. On the morning of the company event, Thomas woke up earlier than usual, without needing an alarm clock. He felt a different kind of anxiety in his body, something between expectation and tension. He spent a long time in silence, watching Helena sleep. She looked serene, her face partially covered by her hair, her lips slightly parted. For a few seconds, he wanted to freeze that moment, save it as a portrait of everything he believed to be true love. He got up slowly, made coffee, buttered the toast, put fruit on the plate. It was Saturday, and that meant Elisa would be with her grandmother, as happened once a month. The house was silent, almost solemn. When Helena came down to the kitchen, her hair already damp and her expression distracted, he looked at her as if he wanted to say something. She noticed, but said nothing. She just smiled, that gentle smile that had comforted him so many times, and asked the exact time of their meeting. He responded naturally, tried to touch her waist, but she subtly moved away under the pretext of picking up the cup. Nothing that would draw attention, but enough to leave a thread of doubt hanging in the air. During the day, he cleaned his shoes, laid out his new shirt, and adjusted his tie more discreetly. He reviewed the emails about the event and confirmed the location. Helena said she still didn't know if she would be able to go. She claimed to have a last-minute meeting with schoolmates to review the guidelines for a new project. Thomas found it strange, but kept quiet. It wasn't in his nature to be confrontational without certainties. She left early in the afternoon and left a hurried kiss on the corner of his mouth, along with an "I'll try to get there on time," and disappeared through the door with a bag larger than usual. He stared into space for a few seconds, then decided to focus on what he could control, getting dressed, keeping his mind clear, trying to enjoy the night. The atmosphere in the event hall was festive, the soft lights reflected on the lined-up glasses, and the smiles of his colleagues showed that the evening would be memorable. Thomas walked between the tables, receiving greetings, and exchanging small talk. Some asked for Helena, and he, with a half-smile, said that she might arrive later. When the couples began to enter together, he noticed the exchanged glances, the intertwined hands, the poses for photos. He felt a little out of place, but he maintained his composure. He was there for a reason, and even if he were alone, he would not miss out. It was then, as he approached the bar, that he saw a silhouette he knew very well in the distance. The wine-colored dress, her loose hair with a slight wave, her firm walk. It was her. But what paralyzed him was not Helena's presence. It was the man who accompanied her, slightly behind, as if they were a discreet couple trying not to attract attention. Thomas did not recognize the face immediately, but the way he touched her back, the way he leaned his body in as he spoke in her ear, the way she smiled back intimately, all of this ignited an irreversible uneasiness within Thomas. She felt the blood heat up in her face, her hands sweat. Her first impulse was to retreat, hide, pretend she hadn't seen. But soon after, she took another path. She straightened her posture and walked towards them with firm, measured steps. She stopped in front of the two of them and, without raising her voice, without losing her composure, said, "I thought you should arrive accompanied by your husband." The silence that followed was brutal. The man looked away, disguising it with a yellowish smile. Helena, in turn, remained still. The color in her face disappeared, as if all the blood had escaped from her body. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Only her name, in a whisper, almost begging for this to not be happening there. Thomas didn't shout, didn't push, didn't question. He just looked at her like someone who looks for the last time at someone he no longer recognizes. And then he turned and left, while she remained standing, frozen in the middle of the room with a lost look, perhaps wondering how to fix what was already irreparable. That night became the turning point. Not because of the explicit revelation of an affair, but because of the certainty that settled in Thomas's heart, the certainty that everything he considered stable, loyal and eternal had been violated from within. When he got home, he entered in silence. Each room seemed like a memory. The kitchen still smelled of breakfast, the sofa still had the sunken print of her body. He sat in Elisa's room, looking at the drawings on the wall, the toys scattered around. Everything now seemed like it had been lived in another time, as if it had been borrowed and now needed to be returned. He spent the night awake. In the morning, he packed a simple suitcase, put some clothes, documents, books. He left the house before dawn and went to pick up his daughter at her grandmother's house. There were no explanations. He just said he needed to spend a few days with her. Elisa, even though she didn't understand, accepted. Maybe she felt it. Children feel it. In the car, Thomas held the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were too dry. Elisa looked out the window and at one point said in a calm voice, "Daddy, can I stay with you for a while?" He nodded, without saying a word. In the following days, he avoided any contact with Helena. He didn't answer messages or calls. He only called the school and informed them that Elisa would be staying with him for an indefinite period of time, citing personal reasons. Helena's absence from their daily lives became a vacuum that, paradoxically, brought some relief. The routine with Elisa was lighter, more spontaneous. Father and daughter developed new habits. They walked together to the bakery, read books before bed, and invented recipes for dinner. At no time did he use pain as a weapon. He never said anything that would tarnish his mother's image. But Elisa, little by little, grew closer to her father, naturally choosing his lap, his silence, his way. Helen tried to reconnect. She sent short messages, asked about Elisa, said she needed to talk. Thomas read them and ignored them. Not out of revenge, but because he saw no point in returning to a conversation that, deep down, was already over. Trust, once broken, becomes a shard that is impossible to put back together without hurting. And Thomas, for the first time, was choosing to protect himself. Time passed. Weeks turned into a month. Helena finally appeared in front of the house. She didn't come in. She asked to see Elisa. They talked for a few minutes in the garden. Elisa was affectionate, but she didn't ask to come back. She said she was right there. When her mother hugged her, she responded. But she soon ran back to her father, with that look that mixes security and belonging. Helena noticed. And there, in that simple image, perhaps I began to understand what I had lost. But there was still one piece missing. A part of the story that Thomas never imagined existed. Something buried long before that night in the ballroom. A hidden detail that explained not only the betrayal, but the silences, the distances, the restlessness. And that would forever change the way he saw everything he had experienced. That part was yet to come. It was early autumn when Helena appeared at the door of the house where Thomas now lived with Elisa. She was wearing a simple blouse, no makeup, her face pale, her eyes cloudy. In her hands she carried a brown cardboard box, the kind used for moving. Thomas wasn't expecting anyone that Saturday, nor did he expect to open the door and find the eyes that had once been his refuge. But he didn't move, nor did he invite her in. He just rested his arm on the door frame and remained silent. Helena said she wasn't there to beg, that she knew there was no way back, but she needed to give him something. She said that, above all, she wanted him to know the truth, the part she had never had the courage to confess, not even to herself. Thomas frowned, hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside and made way. The atmosphere in the room was dense, the air seemed heavier than usual. Helena placed the box on the table and asked him to open it. Thomas, silently, removed the lid. Inside were letters, photos, small old objects. A metal brooch, tickets to a literary festival, a black and white photograph of a deserted beach. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope, with her handwriting. He held the envelope tightly, feeling his heart race. Helena asked him to read it there, in front of her. She said she could no longer bear the weight alone, and that, if there was still a shred of dignity between them, she deserved the truth to be told once and for all. Thomas opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. He read it silently, but each line seemed to pierce his soul like shrapnel. Helena watched in silence, and the tears streaming down her face were of a different kind, not of regret, but of release and accumulated pain. When he finished, he remained still, staring at the paper as if trying to process what he had just read. Helena broke the silence, and her voice faltered at first. She said that this story began long before her marriage, before she even met Thomas. She said that, in her youth, she had had a brief and intense relationship with an older man, a married literature professor, with whom she had a clandestine affair that lasted only a few months. It was a forbidden relationship, marked by passion and destruction, and that ended abruptly when his wife found out about everything. Helena never spoke about it to anyone, because she carried not only the shame of another person's betrayal, but also a deep wound. When he abandoned her, she discovered that she was pregnant. Thomas swallowed hard. Helena said that, frightened, she sought out her family, but received only disapproval. Her mother, fearing scandal, pressured her to keep the case a secret. At the end of the second month of pregnancy, she lost the baby. A miscarriage, but she always believed it was caused by stress, guilt, and despair. After that, she decided to rebuild her life, seek a new version of herself, erase that past. It was in this context that she met Thomas. And although it was a true marriage, full of real love, she was never able to completely free herself from what she had experienced. She said that she spent years trying to make up for it, dedicating herself, being a mother, being a wife, trying to convince herself that that story had died. But it didn't. Helena paused for a long time, looked at her clasped hands, and confessed that years later, she had met that man again. That he was a widower, and that chance, or destiny, as she called it, had placed them in the same auditorium for a lecture on contemporary literature. She said she felt something unearthed inside her. Not passion, not desire, but a sick need to understand what had not been resolved. They began exchanging messages. Meetings. And for the first time in years, she let the past invade the present. The man she had been seen with at the company event was not just a coworker, he was that man. That first one. The one who shaped everything. Thomas listened in absolute silence. He didn't blink. He looked like marble. Helena, trembling, said that she hadn't fallen in love with him again. That she had never stopped loving Thomas. But that she had lost herself. That their reunion had reopened all the unhealed wounds. That for months she had tried to deal with it alone. That she blamed herself every day. And that, even before she was caught, she was already planning to end it all. But she didn't have time. Thomas stood up, turned his back, and walked to the window. He stood there for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the street. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. He asked her if she knew what she had done. Not to him. But to their daughter. Helena said yes, that she felt like a criminal inside, that she didn't ask for forgiveness expecting to be forgiven, but because she needed to finally get rid of all that. She said she would accept the silence, the distance, the contempt, but that she needed, somehow, to show him that what had existed between them was not a lie. That it was only tainted by a past she had never had the courage to face. He turned slowly. He asked if the man knew all of this. Helena nodded. She said that he too was carrying guilt, and that they had both realized, too late, that it was not love that connected them, it was guilt, debt, nostalgia. Thomas then walked over to the box on the table, picked up the envelope, carefully folded the sheet, and put it in his pocket. He said that he understood now. But that it did not change what he felt. Love, he explained, does not survive on explanations. It survives on choices. And she, on more than one occasion, chose not to protect them. Before she left, he called her by name. He said that he would still see her as the mother of his daughter. That was why he would always respect her in front of Elisa. But that, from then on, each one would follow their own story. And that he had finally freed himself from the version of himself that spent years trying to be enough for someone who wasn't even whole for himself. Helena walked to the door as if carrying the weight of a lifetime on her shoulders. And before leaving, she whispered that she loved him. Thomas didn't answer. He just closed the door gently. That same weekend, he took Elisa to a new park outside the city. They watched the sunset holding hands, ate popcorn on a park bench, and at the end of the walk, when the girl asked if they could do it again the next Saturday, he replied with a genuine smile, saying yes, life was meant to be lived again, but only with those we choose to live again. 2 months had passed since that last meeting, since the revelation that turned everything upside down and exposed a story that, however painful, seemed necessary. Thomas, true to his word, stayed away. The box with the memories was locked in the back of a drawer that he no longer opened. Not out of denial, but out of decision. In that subsequent silence, there was much more movement than it seemed. Helena disappeared from sight. There were no more calls, no messages, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if she had finally understood that certain doors, even if opened, will never close the same way again. Elisa, for her part, continued to grow, to smile, to fill the house with her calm presence. But there was a more attentive streak in her, a way of observing her father with a maturity that did not exactly fit her age. She understood, even without details, that her mother's absence was not by accident or convenience, but by choice, or consequence. On a gray morning, with light rain dripping down the windows, Thomas received an unexpected call from Elisa's school. The pedagogical coordinator invited him to a meeting to discuss the girl's performance. It wasn't urgent, they said, just a follow-up conversation. He thanked her, wrote down the time, and hung up. On the way to school, he noticed that there was more traffic than usual. The cars dragged along amid the slow pace of the city, and in that scene of honking horns and drops of water on the windshield, he had time to think. Not about Helena, not anymore. But about how he had rebuilt his own existence without realizing it. About how that overwhelming pain had gradually turned into solid ground. He was not the same man who had once offered his whole heart to someone who still bore untreated scars. He was a different man now. With more silence, yes. But with more clarity. He arrived at school 10 minutes early. He entered through the main entrance and was led to a small room with walls decorated with drawings by the students. The coordinator arrived accompanied by Elisa's teacher. The conversation was relaxed. They spoke fondly of the girl, praised her performance, but also mentioned that Elisa had become more introspective lately. Thomas listened attentively, thanked her for her observations, and promised to follow up more closely. As he was getting up to leave, the coordinator casually mentioned that Helena had participated in an activity the week before, as a guest volunteer for a writing workshop. He didn't respond. He just nodded slightly. But inside, something moved. The next day, when she picked Elisa up, the girl mentioned that her mother had shown up at school. She spoke naturally, without any weight. She said that they had talked a little, that she seemed calmer, different. Thomas listened and didn't interrupt. When they got home, Elisa went straight to her room, and he stood in the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from the kettle. Then he decided. Not because he missed her. Not because he had hope. But because he needed to finally put an end to what was still pending inside him. He sent a short message, "If you want to talk, tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the cafe near the library." He sent it. And turned off his cell phone. The next day, he arrived at the place right on time. The cafe was empty, with soft background music and the smell of freshly baked bread. He chose a table in the corner, near the window. A few minutes later, Helena came in. She was wearing a dark blue coat, her hair tied in a simple bun. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she walked towards him without rushing. She sat down without saying a word. The silence between them was thick, almost tactile. She fidgeted with her napkin for a few seconds before speaking. She said she didn't know if she should have accepted, but that when she saw the message, she felt she needed to be there. Thomas nodded in agreement. He asked her how she was. She said she was trying to relearn how to live with her own mistakes. That she had started therapy, something she had put off for years. That she had started writing again. She also said that she often read the texts that Elisa left scattered around the house, and that, even from a distance, she tried to follow her daughter's growth with as much respect as she could offer from a distance. Thomas didn't comment. He just listened. And little by little, Helena began to reveal a new layer of the story. She said that, after that encounter, she decided to face her past head-on. She sought out the wife of the man she had been involved with in the past, the woman whose life had been devastated by a silent betrayal years ago. She said she met her at a volunteer center, that they talked for hours, and that day she understood that true repentance is not built with tears, but with actions. It was at that encounter, she said, that she finally stopped seeing herself as a victim of her own story. Thomas interrupted. He asked her what she expected from all of this. Helena took a deep breath, looked out the window, and then back at him. She said she didn't expect forgiveness or rapprochement. That she no longer wanted to occupy a space that was no longer hers. But she needed to look him in the eyes and tell him that, despite everything, she was happy. And that if Elisa ever wanted to understand her parents' story better, she would have the courage to tell him everything. No frills. No omissions. Thomas nodded. He said that one day it might be necessary. But that, for now, the girl just needed to feel safe. And that he could guarantee that. The waiter interrupted discreetly, bringing 2 cups. Helena smiled in gratitude, but did not touch her coffee. She said she felt ashamed for having taken so many years to recognize that she had always placed the responsibility for her pain on others. That she now understood how much she had stifled her own past, hoping that Thomas's love would be an eternal balm for the wounds she herself had hidden. Thomas then spoke more firmly. He said that he had loved, that he had given his best, but that today he understood that no one can save someone who is not willing to be saved. And that what hurt him was not the mistake, but the lack of honesty. Helena agreed. He said it hurt a lot to realize that. That the last few months had been like looking through a mirror and seeing himself for the first time without adornments. He also said he was leaving the city. He had gotten a job at a school in the countryside, where he would start a reading project with vulnerable young people. It wouldn't be an escape, but a chance to start over. Thomas asked when he would go. She said at the end of the week. And that she would like, if possible, to say goodbye to Elisa. He said the girl had the right to decide. The conversation ended with a handshake that lasted longer than necessary. There was no longer any romantic love there. But there was something that was perhaps even more valuable, respect rebuilt on the rubble of pain. Helena left the cafe without looking back. Thomas stood there for a few minutes, finishing his cold coffee, watching the movement on the street. He felt neither relief nor anger. Only peace. On Friday afternoon, when she came home from school, Elisa found her mother in the garden. The conversation between the two lasted about half an hour. Thomas, inside, did not hear the content, but saw the long hug at the end. When the girl came in, he greeted her with a calm look. Elisa simply said, "She'll be fine, Daddy," and went up to her room. Later that day, Thomas took a wooden box where he kept his tools and took out an old notebook. He began to write. Not a diary, but a letter to Elisa, to be read in the future. In it, he did not talk about betrayals, about hurts, or about names. He talked about courage. About the importance of recognizing limits. About how love also means knowing when to walk away. And about how the purest love he had ever known was born in the womb of a woman he could not accompany to the end, but who gave him the greatest gift of life. Time went on. Helena left. Elisa grew up. Thomas slowly opened his heart to new possibilities. He met someone who made him laugh again, who didn't demand perfection, just presence. And even though the old pain still left its mark, he learned that the scar is just a reminder, not a destiny. And in that house, where one day everything seemed to fall apart, a new kind of wind began to blow. Silent, light, full of life. In the days that followed Helena's departure, a new silence settled over the house. It wasn't the same silence that had emerged after the separation, the one filled with sorrow and uneasiness, but rather a softer, lighter silence that signaled the end of an important cycle. It was as if the walls carried less weight, as if the furniture breathed a sigh of relief and even the air seemed softer. Thomas noticed this not through words, but through Elisa's small gestures, which became more spontaneous, more confident. There was a security in her that came from her father's constant presence, from the feeling of stability that had blossomed again. Still, he knew that their story wasn't over, not because there was anything unresolved, but because life, by its nature, continues to demand decisions even after the great revelations have passed. The daily routines continued. Elisa returned to school with more enthusiasm, began participating in extracurricular activities and, to Thomas's surprise, showed an interest in music. She began taking violin lessons and, every afternoon, filled the house with hesitant notes that, even out of tune, seemed to resonate with his spirit. It was during this period that Thomas began to go out more. First with old friends, then to community events, book fairs, and cultural gatherings. He wasn't looking for someone, he didn't miss romantic company, but there was a latent desire within him to reconnect with himself, with the part of himself he had been before marriage, before responsibilities, before disappointments. During one of these chance encounters, he met Laura, a woman with an easy laugh, a direct gaze, and an infectious calm that seemed to come from someone who had already weathered her own storms and learned to dance in the rain. Their first meeting was unpretentious, a long conversation about books and children. She was also a mother, divorced, with a teenage son. There was no rush, no urgency, just an exchange of stories that flowed smoothly. In the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent, but always within a natural rhythm. Thomas did not consider himself in love, but there was something in that coexistence that awakened forgotten feelings. It was not about starting over, but about starting over differently. Still, he felt torn. On one side, the genuine desire to make room for something new, on the other, the fear that, by doing so, he would somehow erase the history he had lived with Helena, however painful it had been. There was a silent dilemma growing inside him. To what extent is it possible to move forward without disrespecting the scars of the past? One night when Elisa went to bed early, he and Laura walked through a wooded park, lit only by spaced streetlights. The conversation flowed until it touched on deeper topics. Laura told him about the difficult breakup she had experienced, her guilt, her fears, and her failed attempts to start over. When she asked about his ex-wife, Thomas hesitated for a few seconds, but decided to tell her. Not with cruel details, not with victimization, but with the clarity of someone who had already processed enough to speak without resentment. Laura listened attentively, and in the end she simply said that he seemed like a man who had survived a 1,000-meter fall without losing the ability to walk, and that, in itself, was admirable. That sentence echoed in him for days. Not as a compliment, but as a reflection. Had he really survived? Or was he just walking by inertia, waiting for time to resolve what he still didn't have the courage to face completely? He began to wonder if he had, in fact, forgiven himself for having trusted too much, for not having noticed the signs, for not having asked questions that might have avoided some of the pain. Because, deep down, he knew that Helena's betrayal hadn't started the moment she met her old lover again, it had started much earlier, in the silent neglect of the space that existed between them. A space that he didn't notice growing, that she didn't know how to fill, and that, together, they pretended not to see. One winter night, while Elisa was finishing her schoolwork and the house was peaceful, Thomas picked up the notebook where he had started writing the letter to his daughter. He went back to the pages, reread passages, and added new ones. This time, he wrote about choices. About how life is made up of intersections, and that it is not always about right or wrong, but about the courage to accept the consequences of the path chosen. He spoke about the value of honesty, not only with others, but especially with oneself. And, for the first time, he wrote a sentence addressed to Helena, as if he still needed to free himself from one last bond. You were not the end of my story. You were just a part that needed to happen so that I could find who I really was. The following weekend, he took Elisa to visit her grandparents. It was something he did from time to time, but this time, he felt it would be different. During lunch, his mother started a conversation about the past, about how difficult it was to see him suffer in silence, about how she wished he would allow himself to be happy again. Thomas smiled, hugged his mother and replied that he was learning, in his own time, in his own way. And that, despite everything, there was gratitude in his heart. Because even the deepest pain teaches, and, in his case, it taught him to love more consciously. When he returned home on Sunday night, he found an envelope in the mailbox. He recognized Helena's handwriting. It wasn't usual, but she had left notes before, especially when she wanted to deliver something to Elisa. He opened it calmly. It was a short letter, written with an objectivity that almost hurt. She said that she was adapting well to the new city, that she had started a new project with teenagers and that this made her feel useful again. At the end, she said that if Thomas was ever willing, she would like to meet him again not as an ex-husband, not as a past, but as someone who shared an important story. Not to relive anything, but to look at everything with the maturity of someone who has finally understood that love also means accepting the mistakes we make. Thomas folded the letter and put it away with the other one, the one that revealed the ancient secret. After that, he went up to Elisa's room, kissed her on the forehead and stayed there for a few minutes watching his daughter sleep. He thought about time, how it doesn't cure everything, but it offers perspective. He thought about Laura, about the possibility that was taking shape there calmly, truthfully, with presence. He thought about himself and realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was where he wanted to be. Without rushing, without guilt, without the burden of having to prove anything. The moral dilemma that still throbbed in his mind was subtle but profound. Would moving forward require leaving behind everything that had been? Or would it be possible to build something new without erasing the marks of what made you who you were? That doubt would accompany him for some time, perhaps for the rest of his life, but it no longer paralyzed him. On the contrary, it made him walk more carefully, with more responsibility for his choices. And so, the story continued. No longer dragged by chains, but guided by firm steps, with exposed scars, yes, but not painful. Because sometimes the greatest sign that we are ready to begin again is not the absence of pain, it is the presence of peace. The days following Helena's letter brought Thomas a serenity that was neither euphoria nor immediate relief, but a kind of silent understanding that the cycles had truly ended. It was like crossing a bridge that, even after it was completed, still left marks on his feet. He began to see every gesture of his daughter, every word spoken at breakfast, every small detail of daily life as something sacred, a privilege that, before, went unnoticed in the rush of obligations and restrained silences. Laura was still present, but in a balanced, respectful way, never demanding more than he could offer. She understood the complexity of feelings, memories and spaces that needed to be reorganized over time, and perhaps for that very reason, Thomas felt so comfortable with her. There was a mutual understanding there, a silent pact of patience, and that was more valuable than any hasty promise. It was on a cold Thursday afternoon that Laura invited him for a different kind of outing. He said he wanted to show him a place he used to go with his son when he was younger, a little-known park hidden behind an old disused railway line. They drove there, crossing narrow streets and avenues lined with dry trees and old lampposts. When they arrived, they found an open space with wooden benches covered in leaves, a small lake in the center, and a feeling of isolation that seemed more like protection. They sat on one of the benches and remained silent for a few minutes, listening to the birds and the sound of the water in the background. It was then that Laura, in a low voice, asked if Thomas allowed himself to be happy now, not out of obligation or expectation, but because he deserved it. He took a while to answer, not out of hesitation, but because he needed to think about the question with the depth it required. He said yes, but that happiness, for him, now came in a different form. That it was no longer euphoria, nor achievement, nor a wish fulfilled. It was knowing that I could breathe without fear of losing everything. It was sleeping peacefully. It was watching Elisa grow up and knowing that she felt loved. Laura smiled, and at that moment, without any big gestures, she held his hand for the first time. That same week, Elisa brought home a note from her teacher. It was an invitation to the end-of-semester musical performance, where the students in the class would play simple passages on the instruments they had been learning. It would be the first time Thomas would see his daughter in public, in front of an audience, with a violin in her hands. And, even though he was a reserved man, his heart raced just imagining the moment. In the days leading up to the performance, she noticed that Elisa was practicing more than usual, but she was also showing signs of anxiety. He asked her if she was nervous, and she said yes, but that what worried her most was not knowing if her mother would be there. Thomas looked at her calmly, thought about the best way to respond, and then said that sometimes a few absences teach more than 1,000 presences. Elisa nodded, but didn't comment further. That night, he wrote a few more pages in his notebook, trying to record the complexity of that conversation, what she said and what she didn't say. He tried to build for Elisa, in the future, a clear emotional map of everything they lived, without accusation, without romanticization, just with truth. On the day of the performance, the auditorium was full. Plastic chairs were lined up, the stage was improvised, and the lights were soft. Thomas sat in the third row, next to the aisle. Laura arrived a few minutes later, and he saved a seat for her. When Elisa walked onto the stage, violin in hand and her hair tied back in a ponytail, Thomas felt his chest swell with pride. This was his daughter. Not just by blood, but by her courage, her calm expression, and the dignity with which she carried her own story. She played confidently, missing only one note at the end, but smiling as if every second had been worth it. When she finished, she glanced discreetly at her father in the audience, and he responded with a slight nod, a smile that was restrained but full of meaning. After the event, in the schoolyard, Thomas and Laura waited while Elisa talked to her classmates. It was then that Helena appeared. She was dressed modestly and held a flower wrapped in plain paper. She wore no makeup or adornments. She was just shy and reserved. When she saw her father, she walked slowly towards him. Their eyes met, and there was no need to say anything. She simply asked if she could speak to her daughter. Thomas nodded to indicate where Elisa was. Helena approached, crouched down to the girl's height, and held out the flower. The conversation between the two was brief, but full of emotion. Elisa accepted the flower, said something that made her mother smile, and then hugged her lightly. It was not a hug of reconciliation or desperate longing, it was a gesture of maturity, acceptance, and tenderness without naivety. When Helena walked away, she returned to Thomas, looked at Laura with a polite nod, and simply said, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked away. On the way home, in the back seat of the car, Elisa looked out the window, thoughtful. When they arrived, Thomas went to his daughter's room, knocked lightly on the door and went in. He asked if everything was okay. She said yes. She said she understood better now. That her mother had made bad choices, but that she, Elisa, also had the right to choose who she wanted to be with. She said she felt stronger now, that she liked the life they were building, and that she thought it was beautiful when she saw her father smiling with Laura. Thomas hugged her, and in that hug there was an unbreakable complicity. The weeks that followed were calm, but not slow. Thomas got involved in a volunteer project with children, encouraged by Laura, and discovered an unexpected pleasure in helping to transform small realities. Elisa delved deeper into music and began writing short stories, leaving them scattered around the house. Laura started to visit the house more often, but always with caution, always respecting Thomas and her daughter's space. And it was on one of those afternoons, while the three of them were drinking hot chocolate while watching an old movie, that Elisa, without taking her eyes off the screen, asked if they thought it was wrong to rebuild happiness with other people, even after everything they had been through. Thomas looked at Laura, then at his daughter, and replied that the mistake, sometimes, is not in trying again, but in trying the same way. And that true courage is in loving slowly, without forgetting what happened, but also without allowing the past to dictate the present. That night, Thomas stayed awake after everyone else had gone to sleep. He went out onto the porch, sat quietly, and looked up at the sky. There was no more pain in his chest, no more anger, no more sense of loss. There was a kind of gratitude that came from a deep understanding of everything he had experienced. Helena had been a part of his life. A painful part, but also a meaningful part. The betrayal had not defined him. The abandonment had not destroyed him. And the new love was not a replacement, it was a continuation. Different, more aware, more mature. Over time, he realized that happiness was not in repairing what was broken, but in building something new with the pieces that were left. That true love is not the kind that never fails, but the kind that, even after failing, teaches us to move on with dignity. And, most of all, he understood that being strong is not about enduring everything alone, but about allowing yourself to start over when your heart is ready. The end had not yet come. But for the first time, he knew exactly where he was going. The following spring, when the trees began to bloom again and the weather seemed more open to new beginnings, Thomas received a letter from Elisa's school. It was an invitation to the closing ceremony of elementary school, an important milestone for all parents and children. At the bottom of the invitation, a handwritten space indicated that the student had requested that the closing speech be read by a parent. When Thomas saw it, he didn't know whether to smile or cry. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Elisa, at the height of her precocious sensitivity, chose her father to be the voice of this new cycle. Without ever using the words forgiveness or abandonment, she demonstrated with silent actions who had remained by her side when everything seemed uncertain. That, for Thomas, was the true victory. Not a trophy, not a settling of accounts with the past, but proof that his constant love, his firm and silent presence, had shaped his daughter's heart with the dignity that he had worked so hard to preserve. The ceremony was held in the school theater. The seats were filled with parents, teachers, restless students, and anxious family members. Thomas went up on stage with the paper in his hands, took a deep breath, and read with restrained emotion, but present in every syllable. The text, written by Elisa, spoke about growth, about the choices that define who we are, and about the value of those who remain. It said that a true family is not always the one that starts together, but the one that chooses to walk together until the end. When he finished reading, there was a brief silence, followed by heartfelt applause. In the middle of the audience, Helena, sitting discreetly in the last row, was wiping her eyes. She did not go up to Thomas, did not try to talk, did not look for Elisa that night. She was simply present, as someone who understands that sometimes, love means knowing how to stay apart. Over the following months, Thomas and Laura consolidated their relationship. It was a patient process, built on mutual care and respect. Elisa developed a natural bond with Laura, not as a substitute for her mother, but as someone with whom she shared affection and moments. The relationship was not imposed or rushed. It emerged from sincere sharing, from advice given on study afternoons, from spontaneous laughter at dinner. One day, without warning, Elisa called Laura her second home. Not a mother, not a friend, but a safe space where she could exist fully. Laura could not hold back her tears. Upon hearing this, Thomas understood that life had once again gifted him, not with what he asked for, but with what he needed. Helena, on the other hand, remained physically distant, but emotionally close to her own maturation. In the new city, she dedicated herself to the project with teenagers, many of whom had been marked by stories of abandonment, violence and silence. There she found meaning, a way to transform pain into a tool. She began to give lectures, write chronicles, and become a reference for personal reconstruction. For many, she became an example of overcoming. But deep inside her, she missed Elisa. And, although her daughter allowed occasional meetings, they never went back to being together on a daily basis. Helena knew that this was the price, the echo of her decisions, and she learned to accept it without revolt. She began to understand that love, sometimes, is knowing how not to insist where one is no longer essential. A year later, Thomas and Laura got married in an intimate event in the garden of the house where he lived with Elisa. There were few guests, no ostentation, just close friends and family. Elisa was the one who led the vows, and in her speech, with a firm voice, she declared that she was happy to see her father choose someone who made him truly smile. At the end of the ceremony, Thomas held Laura's hand with a lightness that is only possible for someone who has had their heart broken and put back together piece by piece. That night, while everyone celebrated under lights strung between the trees, Helena walked past the gate of the house, watching from a distance. She didn't go in. She just looked for a few minutes and left. She knew that this was no longer her place. And although it hurt, I also knew that that silence was the most dignified way to say goodbye. Years passed. Elisa went to college and chose psychology. She said she wanted to understand people's pain, help families rebuild themselves, and prevent others from going through silences like the ones she had experienced. Thomas followed her every step with pride, closely watching that girl who, even in the midst of a storm, had learned to dance in the rain. She no longer wrote letters in her notebook, but she maintained the habit of recording random thoughts, scribbles of memories, fragments of a story that had transformed her. She never forgot what she had experienced with Helena. She never had to erase them. She simply learned to give her memories another place. Not in the center, but on the edges of what really mattered. Laura stayed by his side, with the same calm that defined her from the beginning. She never tried to occupy spaces that were not hers. She was his partner, advisor, companion. Together, they traveled, started over, made mistakes, learned. And if there were any hurts, they were overcome with dialogue, with maturity, with the wisdom of someone who understands that love is not about perfection, but about persistence and respect. And Helena? He continued his journey in silence, far from the spotlight of Thomas and Elisa's life. But he knew how to find purpose in what was left. He never rebuilt a new marriage, never tried to repeat history. He preferred to dedicate himself to what was outside of it, perhaps out of fear of revisiting wounds, perhaps by choice. And that was also worthy. Because not everyone finds redemption in the love of another person. Some find it in the usefulness they offer the world. And that is also love. Today, if someone were to ask Thomas if he had forgiven, he might say yes, but not in the way many expect. It was not the forgiveness of someone who forgets, but of someone who has learned not to let resentment dictate his steps. And that is more liberating. The betrayal that tore him apart, that destroyed his idea of security, also led him to the most complete version of himself. And so he does not harbor hatred. Only memories. A memory that, although sad, paved the way for the peace he lives today. If you followed this story so far, now I want to hear from you. Comment below what you thought of this story. What would you do if you were in Thomas's shoes? Do you believe that forgiveness is possible? Or that there are mistakes that simply break forever what was once whole? And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to do so now. Here, every week, you'll hear stories like this one, intense, profound, moving, always with a clear message. This story, like all the ones we tell here, is fictional. But the lesson is real. Betrayal doesn't just destroy marriages. It erodes the most valuable thing between two people, trust. It turns homes into battlefields, turns children into spectators of painful silence, turns love into doubt. Therefore, we reiterate, this channel does not support, justify or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show, with realism and sensitivity, the deep emotional consequences it causes, and, who knows, help someone reflect before crossing the line that can change everything forever.